Hello and good afternoon to all our guests, wherever you actually may be. On behalf of Boğaziçi University, it is a great pleasure to welcome you to our university for another Boğaziçi lecture, where we will have a chance to listen to an exceptional scientist and an exceptional public intellectual. Before moving on, I would like to mention a note of thanks. In the midst of this pandemic, we are very happy that we are able to continue with the main mission of our university and carry on as best as we can with the academic activities on campus. In that regard, it has been essential that our colleagues in different departments help us. And I would like to acknowledge and thank our colleagues in two offices. One is our colleagues in the Office of Corporate Communications, and the other our colleagues in the Information Technology Department. We are grateful to them for the fantastic work they've done so that all our academic activities, including these lectures, our classes, run smoothly without any problems. We appreciate that very much. So before moving on to introducing our guest speaker, Professor Robert Sapolsky, let me also say a few words about the Boğaziçi lectures. It is a lecture series initiated in 2013 as part of the university's sesquicentennial celebrations, marking the 150th anniversary of the founding of Boğaziçi University. This lecture series aims to bring together prominent thinkers of our times with the Boğaziçi University community and contribute to the social and scientific debates on our campus. And I have to say, we have been extremely lucky to have hosted and to continue to host distinguished academics, artists, and thinkers from a variety of disciplines. Since 2019, Boğaziçi lectures have been generously supported, or as we like to say, powered by Tekfen Holding. This series is called Boğaziçi Lectures Feyyaz Berker series, a title dedicated to the memory of Feyyaz Berker, a distinguished alumni and one of the founders of Tekfen Foundation, to whom we thank for their unwavering support for scientific and cultural activities of our university. Now, let me introduce today's distinguished speaker, Professor Robert Sapolsky. He is a distinguished neuroscientist, neuroendocrinologist, and evolutionary biologist. Although his main research interest can be summarized as stress, neuronal death, and gene therapy, he has done work in and has written on a variety of topics. His lifetime work on biology of behavior includes both laboratory work and challenging fieldwork. What I mean by challenging fieldwork may be more clear if I say that for more than 20 years, he spent a few months every year in Africa to study baboon behavior. Professor Sapolsky received his undergraduate degree from Harvard University and moved on to Rockefeller University for his PhD in neuroendocrinology. He has been a faculty member at Stanford University since late 1980s, where he is currently the John A. and Cynthia Fry Gunn Professor in Biology, in Neurology and Neurological Sciences, as well as in Neurosurgery. He is also an associate at the Institute of Primate Research, National Museums of Kenya. In addition to the immense scientific output, more than 100 publications and 4,000 citations, just to name a few, he has also published several series of popular science books, sharing his science and views with the public at large. Those of us who are outside his area of expertise have been very lucky to have those books. On a personal note, I remember reading both The Why Zebras Do Not Get Ulcers and The Trouble with Testosterone with great interest and enjoyment several years ago when they were published. In addition to the two books I mentioned, I might add Monkey Love, a primate's memoir, and more recently Behave as other examples of his effort to bring science to non-experts. His most recent writings include studies of social issues within an evolutionary biology perspective. Among those, the following titles would give you an idea of the questions he is interested in. The Health-Wealth Gap, This Is Your Brain on Nationalism, Double-Edged Swords in the Biology of Conflict. And I'm sure that these themes are going to be seen in today's talk. Before leaving the floor, or the screen more appropriately, to Professor Sapolsky, I would like to remind our audience members that they can send their questions through the chat function in Zoom. I will try to ask as many of your questions and direct them to Professor Sapolsky as possible during the question and answer session. So on behalf of Boğaziçi University, it's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Sapolsky to Boğaziçi University. Professor Sapolsky, the floor is yours.
Thank you for that introduction. I wish I could be at your university in person. I wish the entire planet were not in its current disastrous state with this pandemic. Here in the United States, we are just on the edge of 100,000 people dead from this horrible disease. So it is a true disaster for everyone. It would be nice to be there in person, but thank you for making this possible. Let's see, perhaps I should share my screen now. This evening, let me begin by telling you about a fantasy that I have had since I was about 10 years old. And this was my fantasy of what if I had been able to capture Adolf Hitler? What if I single-handedly was able to break my way into his secret bunker and overpower him and wrestle him down and put handcuffs on him, and I would be able to say, Adolf Hitler, I arrest you for crimes against humanity. And then at that point, I would begin to have the fantasy go in a direction that was very difficult, because it would have to be about what would I have done if I had had Hitler? And it is not difficult for me to come up with ideas if I allow myself. I would sever his spinal cord. I would blind him. I would destroy his eardrums. I would take out his eyes. I would leave him in a state like that. I would inject him with something that was cancerous and leave him to suffer from cancer like that. This is a fantasy, again, that I have had since I was about 10 years old. And when I have this fantasy, my heart beats faster. My breathing becomes faster. All of these plans for the most evil soul in history, most deserving of punishment. But I have a problem, which is I do not actually believe in souls. I don't believe there is such a thing as evil or good. I believe we are just biological organisms. None of that makes sense to me. At the same time, I will hear news of some person who has done some horrible crime, and I will think, oh, good, he is captured. He will be put to death with the death penalty in the United States. But at the same time, I work with lawyers here trying to save the lives of people who are being put up for death penalty during trials because I'm opposed to the death penalty. I can watch movies that are very violent and enjoy them, or watch American football and get all excited. And at the same time, I have not hit somebody since I was about 11 years old in school. I'm terribly confused about these issues of violence. In other words, I'm exactly like every human out there when it comes to this issue of what do we do with this planet where it is so easy, so exciting for us to be violent, and at the same time, we are so horrified about it. Now, one of the strangest things about us as a species when it comes to violence is we are not just violent in the way that any chimpanzee would recognize, where we could take something heavy and hit somebody over the head. Yes, that is true. But we can also be violent by pushing a button and killing somebody on the other side of the planet. We can be violent by signing a piece of paper, an order, and committing thousands of people to their deaths. We can be violent by pretending that we don't see and just looking the other way. We could be violent in an extraordinary number of ways. Let me give you the strangest example of human violence that I've ever heard of. And this concerned Indonesia during the 1960s. At that time, there was a right-wing military coup that brought in a right-wing dictatorship for the next 30 years. And in the aftermath, right-wing death squads went around and killed anyone who was an intellectual, who was from the wrong religious group, who was from the wrong ethnic group, more than 1/2 of a million, people in Indonesia were killed during that period. Now, the extraordinary thing was years later, the author, Naipaul, P.S. Naipaul, was traveling through Indonesia, and he had heard rumors, strange rumors, that sometimes when one of these death squads would come to a village and be ready to kill every person in there, strangely, when they arrived, they would bring with them a traditional gamelan orchestra to play music. And years later, Naipaul encountered one of these now elderly leaders of one of these death squads. And this was a national hero, and Naipaul was interviewing him about the things they had done. And eventually Naipaul worked up the nerve to say, you know, I read something crazy. I read that sometimes when you people would come to a village to kill everyone, you would bring a gamelan orchestra. And the man said, oh, yes, yes, of course, we would do that whenever that was possible. And Naipaul would say, but wait, why would you do something like that? And in one sentence, this man summarized everything that is strange, that is impossible about us as a violent species. He looked confused and said, to make it more beautiful, of course. If we are a species that brings a gamelan orchestra when we come to kill every man, woman, and child in a village, we are a very, very strange species. Our problem is not with violence, because when it is the right kind of violence, we love it. We are excited. We give people medals. We will vote for them in elections. When it is the right kind of violence, we love it. So viewing us as a violent species has to be in that context of the remarkably strange ways in which we are violent. At the same time, there is another puzzle about us, which is, yes, we are the most violent, terribly violent species on this planet, but we are also the most cooperative, the most compassionate, the most altruistic. And what I show here are all things that were invented during the 20th century, ways in which we have become more recognizing of we are more related than we are different. Somebody on the other side of the world could need our help, could need our protection. So we have this huge puzzle here, how to make sense of us as humans as just another primate species. Are we just another primate? Are we just a collection of our neurons and nothing more or less than that? How do we make sense of the biology of us when we are at our worst, most violent moments, and at our best, most humane, most compassionate ones? Now, if you want to understand the biology of that, one thing that is clear is if all you want to understand is the biology of what you are doing with your muscles, the action, it's extremely simple. The brain tells your spinal cord something, which tells your muscles to do something, and hooray, you have behaved. What is challenging, though, is to understand the context of that behavior. Because in one setting, for example, you pull a trigger and you have fired a gun, and it is the most damaging, terrible thing imaginable. In another setting, you pull a trigger and it is so that people will shoot at you instead of at these innocent people. It is the most wonderful thing you can imagine. In one setting, you put your hand on top of somebody else's as a moment of deep compassion. In another setting, you put your hand on theirs, and it is a moment of you beginning to betray the love of your loved one. Over and over and over, what we have is this challenge of understanding the context of human behavior. The fact that the exact same behavior could be so damaging in one setting and so wonderful in another. Now, if you want to understand the biology of that, that one is extremely complicated. And there's a temptation to decide, I am a neurobiologist, and here is how I can explain everything in the universe by studying the brain. Or I'm an endocrinologist, and this hormone explains everything. Or I am a geneticist, or I am an evolutionary biologist, or I am a developmental psychologist, and here is the one way in which I can explain everything. And if you do that, you are not going to be able to explain anything other than that. You look at a human who has just done one of these behaviors, one of these terrible, damaging behaviors, one of these wonderful ones. And we ask this question, why did he do that just now? Why did he pull the trigger of that gun? And when you ask that question, you are actually asking a whole series of questions. You are asking, what happened 1 second ago in that person's brain that caused him to do that behavior? But you were also asking, what happened seconds to minutes before in the environment that triggered that person to do that behavior? And you were also asking, what happened in the hours to days before that hormones in that person's bloodstream that would make them more sensitive or less sensitive to something in the environment and would cause their brain to do something. And at that point, you were also asking questions about how the brain changed in the months before. What happened when you were a teenager, an adolescent? What happened in childhood when you were a fetus? All the way back to when you were fertilized egg and you were nothing more than your genes. What did genes have to do with how that brain was constructed during childhood, the hormone levels that day, what went on seconds before? And then you have to ask questions 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, what kind of culture were my ancestors making? Because that had something to do with the first minutes of my life and every minute afterward. And eventually, you have to ask questions about millions of years ago. What sort of evolutionary pressures produced the kind of species that I am? So, to begin to make sense of this, we see one of these behaviors. It is wonderful, it is terrible, it is somewhere in between. And we ask, why did that behavior occur? We start with this question, what happened 1 second ago? And if we are looking at humans and their worst behavior, starting 1 second before, we are beginning, of course, with the brain, a part of the brain called the amygdala. The amygdala is about violence. It is about aggression. If you put in an electrode and you stimulate the amygdala, you will provoke violence for no reason. If you go in and surgically destroy the amygdala, this is someone who will never be angry, will never be violent, whether this is a human or a monkey or a rat. So the amygdala is about violence. But the extraordinary thing is, if you take an expert in the amygdala and ask them what this part of the brain is mostly about, they will not talk about violence. They will say the amygdala is about fear, the central part of your brain involved in fear. And the extraordinary thing then, is if you want to understand the neurobiology of violence, you have to understand the neurobiology of organisms being afraid. Now, this whole role of the amygdala in fear is very interesting. Suppose, for example, you see something frightening. Series of lines. And then the next layer turns those lines into a three-dimensional object, and eventually a part of your cortex up there will say, aha, I am looking at a snake, let us tell the amygdala. If that is what happened, you would be dead long before that occurs. That takes centuries from the standpoint of neurobiology. What happens as well is something extremely important. You see this frightening thing, and in a fraction of a second, there is a shortcut that goes straight to your amygdala in under 71 thousandths of a second. In other words, your amygdala knows you are looking at that, while this part of your brain is still like looking for the instructions for how to do visual processing. In other words, your amygdala can know that you were looking at something frightened about 1 second before you even know what it is you were looking at. That's wonderful. Evolution has given us this mechanism, so we have about 1 second jump before something terrible happens to us. But there could be something of a disaster that occurs. Because it turns out you need this part of the brain doing its very slow processing in order to tell you accurately what it is that you are looking at. If you only use this path in that first 1/10 of a second, you get to know there is something frightening there very quickly. But the trouble is, you do not get a very accurate answer as to what it is. And before you know it, you were looking at someone, you were a police officer in this country, and you believe you were looking at somebody holding a gun, and they are holding a telephone. And you pull a trigger, and you have killed an innocent person. And many of you will know that that is a problem in the United States over and over with white police officers killing young black men because, oh, I thought they were reaching for a gun. And you see this happening in a fraction of a second, and we see where this disaster can occur. So we look at the amygdala, and what we see is you cannot understand the neurobiology of aggression without understanding the neurobiology of fear. And the problem with the amygdala is it gets very, very fast sensory information, but it can be inaccurate and a tragedy will then happen. Now we shift now to a second part of the brain called the insular cortex. In most animals, the insular cortex is totally boring what it does. You take a laboratory rat and you give it a piece of food that is rotten, that is spoiled, that is poisonous. The rat bites into the piece of food, and in 1/10 of a second, in a fraction of a second, the insular cortex activates. And the rat has reflexes, it spits out the food. It will cough, it will gag, it will throw up. What does the insular cortex do? It protects us from eating poisonous foods. That's great, that's wonderful. And now you take a human, you take a college freshman who has volunteered for this study, and you put them in a brain scanner and you get them to bite into some disgusting poisonous piece of food. And in 1/10 of a second, their insular cortex will activate and they will spit the food out just like in a rat, just like in a monkey. But now you do something more interesting. Have that person in the brain scanner, do not give them food to bite into, just make them think about eating something that is disgusting. Make them think about eating this insect while the insect pushes against their lips, trying to get out while they force it in. And when you think about it, you will activate your insular cortex. In humans, it is not just disgusting food, it is imagining disgusting food. But now, take it one step further. This person is the brain scanner. They are not eating something disgusting. They are not thinking about something disgusting. But suppose here in America, you were looking at a picture of someone, a white nationalist, who is trying to keep all sorts of neo-Nazi sort of themes there. And perhaps you will look at it and your insular cortex will activate. You are morally disgusted by this person. And when you get to humans, there's suddenly this enormously surprising thing, this insular cortex, which for 80 million years has processed tastes and smells that are disgusting. In the last 20,000 years or so, it has also gained the ability in humans to be activated by moral disgust. And that is why, if you hear something that is sufficiently morally disgusting, you will feel sick to your stomach. You will feel like throwing up. You have a bad taste in your mouth, a bunch of other metaphors, idioms like that. So this is wonderful. This tells you the insular cortex in the last 10,000, 20,000 years has had to be used for this totally novel new human ability to not be disgusted by a taste, but to be disgusted metaphorically by somebody's moral act. And that could be wonderful because sometimes if you want to fight against an injustice, it's not just something to sit there and think about intellectually. It is something where you need a fire inside your body to go and fight it. But there's a problem with this as well. Because sometimes what will count to you as morally disgusting is for somebody else the way that they love someone, the way that they pray, the way that they feel a philosophy, the way they think about what is right or wrong. The trouble is that moral disgust is a moving target. And your idea of moral disgust can simply be based on, oh, those people are so different from me. Those people, it's disgusting what they do. It's wrong, wrong, wrong. And when you do that, all you are setting yourself up for is deciding that just because they are different, they are doing something wrong. So what we see here is the insula is involved in disgust in every other animal out there, but in us, it's moral disgust as well. And what counts as morally disgusting for you may not for the next person. And the things that are most valuable in your life may be morally disgusting to somebody else. And you had better bet that when your insular cortex decides, that is morally disgusting, the first thing it is going to do is activate your amygdala. So now we move to another part of the brain, the frontal cortex. It is the most fascinating part of the brain. I spent 30 years of my life studying a different brain region called the hippocampus, and I am sorry for every day I wasted spending the hippocampus, because it is so much more interesting to study the frontal cortex. What does it do? It is the last part of the human brain to evolve. We humans have more of it than any other species. The frontal cortex makes you do the right thing when that is the difficult thing to do. Long-term planning, gratification postponement, controlling your emotions, controlling your impulses. In other words, if you were in a situation where you were tempted to do something selfish, but you were keeping yourself from doing it, it is because your frontal cortex is working very hard to keep you from doing that. Now, the thing about the frontal cortex is it is very easy to think about its function. What the frontal cortex does is your amygdala is about to do something stupid, something violent, something impulsive, something in the next 1 second. And you think that's a wonderful idea at the time, and you know you are going to regret it for the rest of your life. What does the frontal cortex do? Hopefully, it gets there just in time to stop the frontal cortex from doing something that is stupid, that is a disaster. What we think of is the frontal cortex mostly has top-down control over the amygdala. But what is extraordinary is when you look at the anatomy, the amygdala sends as many projections to the frontal cortex as the frontal cortex does to the amygdala. The amygdala has as much of a role in deciding what counts as the right thing, the correct thing to do, when that is the more difficult thing. And as soon as the amygdala has a role, you are looking at a whole array of things that count as doing the right thing, but the harder thing. It's sitting and practicing your musical instrument when you would rather go out and play with your other friends. It is doing a good job at lying. For example, you were in a circumstance where you were being tempted to lie for some sort of personal gain. You know it's wrong. You know it's wrong. Don't do it. Don't do it. Your amygdala is working very hard. But suppose you decide, I'm going to lie. I deserve to be able to steal that, whatever. The second you decide to lie, your frontal cortex is working very hard at making sure you do a good job at lying, that you look at the person in the eyes the right way, that your voice does not crack, anything like that. If you have a part of the brain that is central to keeping you from resisting temptation, but once you decide, I want that temptation, it does a good job at making you be able to get away with it so that no one knows you are dealing with a very complicated part of the brain. So what we see here is the frontal cortex makes you do that more difficult thing when it is the right thing to do, but what counts as the right thing could be very different in different settings. And what seems right to you is not to the next person. What seems right to you right now, you will regret 1 minute from now. And what we see is there is this notion that the frontal cortex is this wonderfully evolved computer in our brains. It is not a computer. It is constantly being swayed by your emotions and by your instincts and by your reflexes. Another part of the brain, and this is a region that releases the neurotransmitter dopamine. Lots of people know about dopamine. What is dopamine about? It is about reward. Cocaine, drugs like cocaine, opiates, heroin, things like that will release dopamine in this part of the brain. So you say, aha, we understand dopamine. Dopamine is about reward. It is about pleasure. It is about that rush you get after something good happens. But it is more complicated than that. Take a human, take a monkey, take a rat, and train them. Train them so that when a little light comes on, a signal, they've learned if they do work, they are going to get the reward. They have learned this extremely well. Signal, do the work, you get the reward. Once they have learned that, when does dopamine get released from this part of the brain? Not when you are getting the reward. It's released as soon as you get the signal. What is that? You are saying, this is going to be wonderful. I know exactly how to do this. I know if I press the lever 10 times, I'm going to get this reward. It is going to be great. It is not about reward. The dopamine is about the anticipation of reward. And what you see is if you use a drug to block the rise of dopamine, the person does not do the work. They do not have the motivation to do that. So now let's make it more complicated. These are circumstances where you do the work, you get the reward. 100% of the time, it is absolutely guaranteed. Now, let us change things so that you do the work and only about 50% of the time, only about half of the time, you get the reward. What happens to dopamine? As soon as that signal goes on, dopamine goes through the roof like crazy. Why is that? Because you have just included a very important word in your brain. The word maybe. Maybe I will get the reward. I feel lucky today, but no, I always mess up. I just have the feeling if I do the work today, I'll get the reward, but no, I said the wrong thing to this person, I will get punished. As soon as you are saying maybe, you have dopamine pouring out of your brain like crazy, and you will press that lever over and over and over. And this is what the people who understand gambling and how to get an addicted gambler to press that lever over and over. This is why we will press that lever to get good grades in university, to get a good job, to get a good home, to get into a good nursing home when we are 90 years old, to get to heaven afterward. All we have here is maybe, driving the release of this neurotransmitter. Now, a few more brain areas. When we look at dopamine again, it is not just about reward, but it is about the motivation to get that reward. And the word maybe drives that system like crazy. Two last brain regions. Fusiform cortex. It's the part of the brain in primates where you recognize faces. And you put somebody in a brain scanner and you flash up pictures of faces. And with each one, the fusiform cortex will activate in 1/10 of a second. But in the United States, if you take your average subject who is white and put them in the brain scanner and you flash up faces and you flash up the face of someone who is black, the fusiform cortex does not activate as much. The face does not count as a face as much. Or a part of the brain, the anterior cingulate, it is involved in empathy. Show somebody a film clip of a hand getting poked with a needle, and at the moment that happens, the anterior cingulate will activate. But if it is the average white person inside that brain scanner and the skin color of that hand is black, when the needle goes in, The cingulate does not activate as much. It depends on whose face. It depends on whose pain. So that gives us a sense of what is happening in 1 second before. But as we look at this behavior, this wonderful behavior, this terrible behavior, it is not just that 1 second. What is going on in the environment 1 minute before, which triggered the insula to do that, the frontal cortex to do whatever it is doing? And what we see here are an array of ways in which sensory information where you do not even know that it is going on, can affect your behavior. For example, you take a busy bus stop, a place where people will wait for a bus, and you put up a poster with a pair of eyes like that. And if you do that, people will drop less garbage on the ground. They will obey laws more just by seeing a picture. Flash up a picture of those eyes on a computer screen, and someone will cheat less at an economic game that they are playing at the time. Put somebody in a room, and the room smells of terrible garbage, and people become more socially conservative. They become more hostile to immigrants from other countries. It does not change their views about economics, about politics, but by sitting there saying, something feels disgusting, aha, it is those people who are disgusting. An amazing study some years ago, you take judges when they are deciding how long somebody will go to jail. Will they walk free, or will they go and sit in jail for 20 years? And the single best predictor of what judges will decide is how many hours it has been since they have eaten a meal. If you have just had lunch, as a judge, you have a 60% likelihood of giving the person freedom. If it is 4 hours since you've eaten a meal, 0% chance. What is that about? You ask this judge, wow, why did you make that decision? And they will talk about philosophy. They will talk about the Enlightenment, when all along it is their blood sugar levels that are mostly determining that, because when your blood sugar levels are low, your frontal cortex has a difficult time doing the right thing when that is more difficult. So what do we see here? We are constantly being influenced by sensory information that we do not even know is happening, and it is shaping our behaviors. So now let's jump further back. Our behavior has occurred. It is terrible. It is wonderful in between. And we are now asking what was happening in the hours before, in the days before. And what we are talking now about are hormone levels. What did hormones in your brain 1 hour ago have to do with how sensitive you are to this information, to that information, what your amygdala does, what your frontal cortex does? So if we are talking about hormones, and we are talking about humans at their worst, we have to begin by talking about testosterone. What is the problem with testosterone? Why is it that in every species on this planet, practically, that in every human culture, males are so violent? And the answer is, testosterone causes the brain to become violent. Testosterone causes the amygdala to become violent. Testosterone does not cause you to become violent. It does something much more subtle than that. So suppose you have taken 5 baboons. They are in a dominance hierarchy. Number A is the highest ranking. A defeats B 3 times. A defeats C 6 times. B never defeats A. C never defeats A, and so on. You have a dominance hierarchy. Now, take this animal and give him testosterone. Give him so much testosterone, he is growing like beards on his neurons inside his amygdala, so much testosterone, and you say, aha, is he now going to be involved in more aggressive interactions? And the answer is yes, absolutely. So you will say, is this what it occurs? Is he suddenly now defeating A? Is he defeating B? Is he rising up to the top of the hierarchy? Absolutely not. That never happens. He does not go anywhere near A or B. What happens instead is he is a miserable nightmare to poor D and poor E. All that testosterone is doing is taking the patterns of aggression that are already there and making them louder. Testosterone does not cause aggression. Testosterone amplifies the social learning about aggression that is already there. Even more importantly, it turns out testosterone will make you do whatever you need to do to hold on to your status when you are being threatened. Okay, if you're a baboon and somebody is threatening your high status, what you need to do is to be aggressive. But if you're a human, there are circumstances where you gain status in very different ways. For example, there are economic games where you gain status by being more generous. And if you give people testosterone when they are playing that game, they do not become more aggressive, they become more generous. What is that telling us? If you took 1,000 Buddhist monks and you shot them up with testosterone, they would run around like crazy, seeing who could do the most kind, loving acts for strangers. Testosterone is not about aggression. It is not about violence. It is about status. And what we see is our brain is being influenced by hormones. But when it comes to testosterone, the problem is not that testosterone causes aggression. The problem is that we reward aggression. We reward status so much. But now we push further back. Our wonderful, our terrible behavior has occurred, and we are asking what happened in the weeks before, the months before. And what that is about is the fact that the brain will change under different circumstances. Go all the way back to when you were a teenager, and the single most important fact about your brain is that your frontal cortex is not fully mature yet. The frontal cortex does not work completely until you were about 25 years old. And what is amazing with that is, under a circumstance where you give somebody a reward, the dopamine system is not under the control of the frontal cortex yet. So you take somebody who is 15 years old and you give them a reward, and the dopamine response is enormous if it's a big reward. If you were an adult, the change is not so much. You take somebody who is a teenager and you give them a small reward. If it was an adult, they would have a little bit of a rise of dopamine. In a teenager, there's a drop in dopamine. What you have is the lows are lower in a teenager, the highs are higher, because the frontal cortex is not there yet to fully function. What does that tell us? The experiences you have, the environment you go through when you were 15 years old, when you were 20 years old, that is the last chance you have to construct that frontal cortex you are going to have as an adult, where you have 1/10 of a second to decide, am I going to pull a trigger or not? So what we see is adolescence is about your dopamine system going like crazy, but your frontal cortex being immature, and thus the experiences you are having at that time is what is sculpting, what is making your frontal cortex into what it will be as an adult. If that is the last part of your brain that is maturing, by definition, it is the part of the brain that is least controlled by your genes and most controlled by environment. So now we push further back. We have our behavior and we say, what about childhood? What did childhood have to do with the frontal cortex I have now, with the amygdala cortex I have now? And what we see here is childhood matters. Childhood matters into what kind of adult brain you have, and what kind of childhood you have had will determine what kind of adult brain you are going to have. So the question becomes, how does your childhood experience, if you are starving, if you are loved, if you were being forced to marry someone when you were 5 years old, if you were forced to be a child soldier, what does childhood experience, what is the biology of how that affects the brain you will have as an adult. And what we have done here is entered the world of this very, very trendy, exciting new area of epigenetics. Genetics is about your DNA sequences. Epigenetics is how experience regulates your genes. Let me show you an example of this. You are a baby rat, and it turns out some rat mothers are better mothers than other rat mothers. Some rat mothers pick up their children more, they lick them, they groom them, they take care of them better. And it turns out, if you were lucky, if you were a baby rat and you were lucky, you have one of these wonderful mothers, by her doing a lot of licking, a lot of grooming to you, that causes an epigenetic change in your brain. And as an adult, when you grow up, you will have less of a stress response, less stress hormone secretion all the time. So what happens then? Eventually, you as an adult will have your own child, and if you have less stress hormones in your bloodstream, you are more likely to be one of those wonderful mothers who licks and grooms your child a lot. And as a result, your child will have that trait. You are passing on this trait that has nothing to do with genes from one generation to the next, all by experience early in life. And the same thing happens when you were a fetus. If you were exposed to a lot of stress hormones from your mother when you were a fetus, you will have an amygdala, which is bigger when you were an adult, bigger than average, and will see more things as being frightening. And thus, when you were pregnant, your fetus is going to be exposed to more stress hormones, and we pass on this trait for multiple generations. So we see here, early environment can shape the brain that you have, the hormonal system you have, and it can cause epigenetic changes that could be lifelong, that in fact can be passed on to the next generation. So now we push further back. What about your genes? Back when you were just one cell, one fertilized egg, what did your genes have to do with it? And this could be a very controversial subject because it is very easy to be tempted to believe, aha, genes explain everything. We have sequenced the human genome. It is the most amazing domain of science. If you understand the genome, you understand the Holy Grail. It is the book of books that explains behavior. Genes have no idea what they are doing. Because it turns out saying that a gene understands when it is going to be active, it is like saying that a recipe for a cake decides when you are going to make that cake. It has nothing to do with it. All the genes are instructions. What is it that determines when you make that cake, when a gene is activated? The environment. And the critical thing is the same gene will work different ways in different environments. For example, here a whole list of genes, one of them here, a gene called MAO alpha, and it has something to do with brain chemistry. And it turns out MAO alpha comes in two different versions. And studies of rats, studies of monkeys suggested that if you had one of those versions, you were going to be more violent when you were an adult. So this one amazing study looked at this. It followed 17,000 people from when they were children up until adulthood, looking at their genetics. And the question became, if you had the bad version of this gene, were you more likely to be violent as an adult? And the answer was yes, absolutely, but only if you were abused as a child. If you were not a victim of childhood abuse, it did not matter what version of that gene you had. It's not the gene, it's the gene plus the environment in which you were in. Genes have no idea what they are doing. It is environment that is regulating the genes, so much so that after a while, it makes no sense to ask, what does this gene do? You can only ask, what does this gene do in this particular environment? Okay, so that is fascinating. But maybe that is not really so interesting, because you will say, aha, so I am trying to understand what genes have to do with the behavior of penguins. You never find penguins in the desert. They're only living in Antarctica. They only live in one environment. You do not find a rainforest animal living in snow. But when you get to humans, we live in snow, we live in the desert, we live in rainforests, we live in capitalist societies, we live in communist societies, monogamous, polygamous. There's no other species that have invented more different environments. And thus, by definition, there's no other species that is freer from genetics than we humans are. Pushing further back now, forget your genes. How about 500 years ago, what kind of culture were your ancestors inventing? Because that has something to do with what behaviors you will have. For example, people who study this subject, this contrast, the comparison that they make most often is between what they call collectivist cultures. People work together, an entire village will come and do the farming. They will plant the crop for one villager. Everyone comes and does it on Monday. And on Tuesday, they go to the next person. And Wednesday, they all work together. This is the social system you will see in Southeast Asia, in China, in rice farming. And then there are individualist cultures where it is one person working alone and they don't need anyone else. What is the place they always study for individualist mindsets? The United States. So you do comparisons and studies between collectivist cultures like Southeast China, individualist ones, the United States, and you look at mothering style. And if you were born to a mother who was in the United States and she is singing a lullaby to you when you were 1 day old, on the average, she is going to be singing louder than would a mother in a collectivist culture. She is going to be holding you less time than a collectivist mother would. If you were crying, it takes about 1/2 the time for your collectivist mother to pick you up and try to make you feel better than if you have an individualist mother. If you are growing up in a collectivist culture, you will first sleep alone from your mother at an older age than you were growing up with an individualist mother. In other words, from the first hour of your life, the culture that your ancestors were inventing thousands of years ago was influencing what kind of brain you were putting together. So what we see here is different types of cultures evolve from different types of ecosystems. Rice farming in China comes from a different type of ecology than wheat farming in the Western United States. Different types of ecologies produce different types of lifestyles, produce different types of cultures, produce different brains, produce different behaviors. And what we see is brains and genes and cultures evolve together. So what this brings us to now is our final area. Again, we have our wonderful behavior, we have our terrible behavior, and now we have to ask questions that are 1 million years old. What went into the evolution of my species? And people who are interested in the evolution of behavior, they think of it in 3 broad categories of how to think about it. The first area is what they will call individual selection. A species behaves not in order to help the rest of its species. A species behaves to leave as many copies of its genes as possible in the next generation. Individual selection, what has been called the selfish gene concept of evolution, and that is why males of every species out there will fight with each other to get to reproduce. And humans are all about individual selection. For example, currently, there are 16 million humans on Earth who are direct descendants of Genghis Khan, the most reproductively successful human in all of history. Second area, kin selection. Sometimes the best way to pass on copies of your genes are to help your close relatives. I will lay down my life for 2 of my brothers or 8 of my cousins. And what you see there is in species after species, animals cooperate with their relatives and they fight with strangers. And humans are about that as well. You are a human, you are rich, you have a lot of material culture, and what do you do out of kin selection? You leave your money to your child after you are dead. Humans are all about kin selection. Or third, reciprocal altruism. Sometimes someone, an organism, an animal, will help another animal for something in exchange. I will help you, I will be altruistic to you, as long as you reciprocate it. And that's all that humans are about. This is what economics is. I have a fish, you have grain, and we will trade. So, we see everything about human behavior is explained by these principles of evolution until you look closely. And then we humans violate every one of those principles. Individual selection. You want to leave as many copies of your genes as possible. And then there are religious groups where people choose never to reproduce, never to leave copies of their genes. There was an American religious group around 1900 called the Shakers, and they went extinct because they believed that sex was evil. They did not pass on any copies of their genes. Or kin selection. You will take care of somebody if they are a close relative, if they share a lot of genes with you. And then you see families where children are adopted and they are from gene pools from the other side of the planet. Or reciprocal altruism. The rule of evolution is you will be nice to somebody if they are nice to you. But then we humans do something that a chimpanzee looking at would say, are you crazy? Why are you doing that? You're in a foreign city. You are at the airport. You are about to leave. You will never return to that city again. There's no person there you will ever see again. There's no person you can have a reciprocal relationship with. But nevertheless, as you walk into that terminal, you stop for a second and you hold the door open for someone. This makes no sense by the rules of evolution. What we see is over and over, yes, we are a species like any other who has evolved, but we are doing some very complex things that cannot be explained by evolution. So we see evolution of behavior is about individual selection and kin selection and reciprocal altruism, and it looks as if that is all about human behavior until you look closely. So what do we see here? If you want to explain a human behavior, you have to understand what happened 1 second ago, and 1 minute ago, and 1 year ago, and 1 century, and 1 million years ago. What have I just explained for the last hour? Ooh, it is complicated to understand behavior. Wow, that was certainly worth you wasting 1 hour of your time to have that as the lesson to learn. Let me try to make it a little better. It is very, very complicated, so be very careful and very cautious before you decide, I understand why that person did that behavior, especially if that is a behavior that you were judging as being evil, or being violent, or being stupid, or being unintelligent, or being socially destructive, because you almost certainly do not understand why that behavior has occurred. So amid all of this information that I've been pouring out here, and I know this has been an enormous amount, the single most important fact about all of this biology is that the biology can change. The brain you have today is different from the brain you had 1 month ago. The hormone levels you have today are different from the levels you will have tomorrow. Which genes are activated are going to change. Change can happen on an enormous level. Change can occur ecologically over the course of thousands of years. In the middle of the Sahara Desert, which is as dry, as hot as you can get, archaeologists will find carvings on stone there of a hippopotamus. because 1,000 years ago, the Sahara was full of rivers and grassland and all of that. Ecosystems can change over the course of centuries, millennia. Cultures can change. During the 19th century, the 18th century, the most frightening people on earth were the people from Sweden. They were the most militaristic people in the world. They spent all of the 18th century invading Russia over and over and over again. And then somewhere around 1815, something happened and the Swedes decided this is stupid. We are instead going to construct a society where we take care of the poor and we have education for everyone. And the Swedes have not had a war for more than 200 years. So cultures can change. But most importantly, brains can change, people can change. People can change in dramatic ways. This is a man named John Newton. And in the early 1800s, he was a British theologian. He was from, I believe, the Anglican Church. And as an old man, he played one of the central roles in the British Empire banning slavery. Wonderful. Amazingly, as a young man, John Newton was the captain of a slave ship. He spent years buying and selling slaves. And when he stopped being a slave captain, did he become somebody looking for freedom for slaves? No, he went to divinity school and he invested his money in slavery and grew very rich. And 35 years after he stopped slaving, something changed. Something changed in his brain as to who counted as a fellow human, whose pain mattered, whose face mattered. Something changed, and I do not know if this religious hymn is known in Turkey, but what he became most famous for was for writing a religious hymn, a Christian hymn called Amazing Grace, a song about his transformation from someone who was a sinner to someone who was like this in his old age. Sometimes change like that can occur in settings of warfare. On the left is a man, a Japanese man named Zenji Abe, on the morning of December 7th, 1941. And he was about to lead a squadron of bomber planes from Japan attacking Pearl Harbor in the United States. He was one of the lead pilots on it. And 50 years later to the day, here is the same man who came to Pearl Harbor for a ceremony honoring the men, the soldiers who were there at the time, who were still alive. And as an old man, Zenji Abe came forward and in broken English, he said, "I am sorry for what I did to you." And he and some of those survivors became close friends for the rest of their lives. Change can occur like that. But sometimes you do not need decades and decades like John Newton. You do not need 50 years like Zenji Abe. Sometimes it could happen in one day. In many ways, the most remarkable event of World War I, for me at least, was during Christmas in 1914. In France, in the trench warfare of France, it was the first winter, the first Christmas of World War I, and the various leaders negotiated, we are going to have a truce. The afternoon before Christmas, all of the fighting is going to stop for 3 hours so that soldiers, British soldiers, German soldiers can come out of the trenches, and for 3 hours there is no fighting so they can carry their dead back to bury them. So the time came and the fighting stopped and British soldiers and German soldiers came out to collect their dead. And then after a while, they started helping soldiers from the other side carry their dead. And then they started helping soldiers from the other side dig graves in the frozen ground. And before you knew it, they were praying with each other over their dead. And they were sharing Christmas dinner together, and they were exchanging gifts, and they were exchanging food. And the next day, when they were supposed to go back to fighting, they refused to go back. And up and down the hundreds of miles of trenches of France, German soldiers and British soldiers played football with each other. And they exchanged weapons, and they exchanged medals, and they exchanged addresses with each other. So when this damn evil war is over with, we can visit each other in our homes. And they made agreements to shoot over each other's heads. And in some places, those truces went on for 3 or 4 days before the officers had to arrive and said, we will shoot you unless you go back to trying to kill those people. What is this lesson here? These men who had an entire lifetime of nationalist garbage, of militaristic training, all it took was 1 day for them to change in their brains who counted as us and who counted as them. And us became us, all of us in the trenches on both sides, and them became any leader who would have us killed so that they could gain glory. What do we see here is we can change. We can change, and there is an amazing amount of biology that could teach us how this can happen. There's a famous quote from an American philosopher, George Santayana, from around 1900, and everybody hears this quote: if you do not study history, you are destined to repeat all the mistakes of history. I think in this case, we have exactly the opposite. If you do not study the history of how humans can change, if you do not study the science of the biology of humans can changing, if you do not understand that, you are destined to not be able to repeat moments of amazing human behavior like that. So on that note, let me stop here and wish all of you the best of luck in your best moments and your worst moments. So thank you.
Hope you're going to be able to hear me.
Yes.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Professor Sapolsky, for this excellent and stimulating talk in the early hours of the morning in your part of the world. And we appreciate it. Thank you so much. So I will move on to questions. We have several excellent questions, so I'll try to manage through those questions. And I hope that my friends are going to warn me about the time, so I'll stop when the time it is to start. So we have lots of general questions as well as specific questions. And I'd like to start with questions that are more directly related to what you talked about today. And one question is actually, I think you have, this question came sort of in the middle of the talk. I think you have referred to it or responded to it later on, but let me just summarize that question. It says in her book, How Emotions Are Made, Lisa Barrett claims that emotions aren't universally pre-programmed in our brains and bodies, but rather they are psychological experiences that we construct based on our unique personal history, physiology, and environment. So how would that fare with your assessment of how emotions are experienced and constructed?
Well, I think I am giving a very subtle answer because I think she is a wonderful scientist. And in fact, if you look at the American version of her book and look on the back of it, I am one of the people who read it beforehand and said, this is a wonderful book, go buy it, go read it. What I believe is the most basic of our emotions and the strongest of them are universal. And it is the same neurobiology in us as in a chimpanzee, as in a baboon. It is just on a continuum. Our version is more sophisticated. When it comes to the context for the emotion, when it comes to the more subtle versions of it, when it comes to the secondary aspects of the emotion, I believe she is completely right. It is a psychological construct. It is a social construct. But what is most interesting here is the play between us. For example, this way that our brain in 1/10 of a second will decide, aha, that face I am looking at, is that person one of us or is it one of them? I believe this is universal. This occurs in every human. It occurs the exact same way in every other primate out there. I believe it is inevitable that we break the world in 1/10 of a second into who is an us and who is a them. But at the same time, it is psychologically, it is culturally incredibly easy to manipulate us as to who counts as an us and who counts as a them. And what we see there is the person who 1 second ago you would be willing to kill, now in a different setting, 1 second into it, you would be willing to die for that person. What we have here is this enormous power of psychological and cultural context.
Okay, thank you. Now I'll have moved to a more specific question, which asks, is it possible to say that people who are better in terms of controlling the response of the amygdala have stronger frontal lobes, let's say stronger neural connections? And is there a link between suppression of behavior and the number of axons, those kinds of structures in the brain?
Great. A lot of the time, yes, because if you were thinking, I want to yell at this person, I want to tell this person, this is the most terrible food I have ever eaten, you are a terrible cook, this is horrible. If you want to do something like that and you manage not to do it, it is because your frontal cortex is getting there in time. And what you see absolutely on the average, you take your average person, put them in a brain scanner, and you look at the average metabolic rate of their amygdala and the average metabolic rate of their frontal cortex. And on average, the higher the frontal metabolism, the lower the amygdaloid. On average, they are working in opposition. For example, again, you take somebody, put them in a brain scanner, and you were taking somebody in the United States who is white, and you were flashing up pictures of faces, and you flash up a face of someone who is black, and in about 75% of white Americans, the amygdala will activate in 1/10 of a second. Oh my God, that's terrible. What you see then is in about 10% of those people, the amygdala will stay on like that for seconds, for minutes, for a lifetime. But in the majority of the people where the amygdala turns on, about 3 seconds later, the frontal cortex activates and the amygdala goes silent. What is the person thinking? Oh my God, don't think that way. That's not the person who I am. I am a better person than that. That's a terrible thing. And you see this sudden change there. You see somebody who is being tempted whether or not to steal something while they're in a brain scanner, very clever research. And if they are going to do it, while they decide to do it, you slowly see the frontal cortex loses to the amygdala. You look at somebody where that never happens and it is not a struggle for them. So yes, to some extent, if you are going to be doing the right thing, it is because your frontal cortex can control your amygdala, and there are other brain regions like that. And it has a ton to do with how many axons you grew that day when you were 9 years old and that event happened and you learned an important moral lesson that day. And it's going to have something to do with whether you were traumatized as a soldier when you were 20 years old. And it is going to have something to do with whether you have eaten breakfast yet that day. All of this biology will be turning into the biology of what part of your brain is going to do what in the next 1 second.
Okay, thank you. A question actually about the research that you mentioned in different contexts. It seems that in terms of that us versus them, the research examples come from mostly white individuals, Caucasians, being biased about black faces, or the needle example that you mentioned. One listener actually wondered if the opposite is also true. Is there evidence that this is irrespective of the race or whatever the us and them characteristics are?
That's a wonderful question. And it gives the most depressing answer you can ever possibly imagine. Okay, so early experience. First off, I said about 75% of white people in America will have that response. Who are the 25% of people who do not have the response? They grew up in a neighborhood with people of different races. They had a romantic relationship once with somebody of a different race. Early experience is not making you wonderful, making you into the Dalai Lama. It is just making you into having different categories of who is an us and who is a them. So now you say, does it go in the other direction? And what is fascinating, first are some studies. You take a child born in China who is an orphan, the parents are dead, and they are adopted into the United States into a Caucasian family. So take them and do the same sort of studies for them. Or you have a Black child from Ethiopia who is adopted into the United States into a white family, put them into the brain scanner, do the same sort of studies, and when you flash up a Black face, the amygdala activates. Who do I belong to? It's what my parents looked like. It's what my neighbors looked like if they were raised in that sort of community. Here's the most depressing thing of all, which is when you take Black Americans and you put them in a scanner and you do the exact same sort of study, about half of the time, it is the Black face that activates the amygdala, not the white face. And in American history during the 1950s, when we still had segregation, in about 5 years before I was born, when the courts decided that is not good, Black bathrooms, white bathrooms, Black schools, white schools, just hell on earth when that was the case. This sociologist did this famous study of taking children, little girls, playing with dolls. And here is a white doll, and here is a Black doll. And which doll do you want to play with? Which doll is prettier, is more beautiful than the other one? Which one is a nicer person? And what they found was about 90% of white kids and about 60% of the small Black children said, wow, the white dolls are nicer. They're prettier. I want to be more like them. And it was this research that was among that was presented to the Supreme Court of the United States when in 1952, they said, you cannot do this anymore. We have to change this whole system. And what is terrifying is you do that study today, and a lot of the time you still get the exact same result. So who counts as a them has a lot to do with what sort of poison your society has been teaching you from the moment you were growing up.
Thank you. Here is a question from a faculty member, a colleague. She says she's observed that despite the immense importance of context from molecular to behavioral level, it's underrepresented in neuroscience research, but more importantly in the development of educational and social policies. So would you agree with that statement? And if so, do you have any suggestions as to how to strengthen that link?
Yes, that's a wonderful question. I like sit in my department and the provost of our university has given us money. We can hire a new assistant professor. And what are we going to hire? And I'm thinking, oh, we've got to get somebody who studies the amygdala or the frontal cortex. And I'll make a big speech about that. And they'll say, okay, yeah, you've convinced us. Let's get a molecular biologist who studies 2 genes inside the neurons of this one sub-area, the frontal cortex. We need to get a molecular biologist who could do optogenetic studies on like mice. And I said, no, can't you get somebody who actually like studies whole organisms? It's like everybody in this department now is a molecular biologist. I can't stand it. Nobody there even knows what an animal looks like, let alone what human behavior looks like. And there's this tremendous bias in the sciences in the direction of more reductive. And then I go to some like meeting in like the psychology department or the sociology department. Some friend there says, come to it. And they're talking about stuff and they're talking about, oh, what do we do about crime? What do we do about substance abuse? And someone says, well, biology, there's biological influences. And they say, oh my God, you right-wing, terrible nationalist person. You racist, you whatever. don't mention genes, don't mention, and it's all social context. And what we see here is that everybody is living inside their discipline like this. And if you go 1 inch behind outside the walls, no, that's not real science, that's not real research. And that's certainly the case in education. In terms of, you do not teach people to think in a multidisciplinary way. You teach people how to do well on the exams that will get you into a good university. And that's the educational system over and over.
Okay, here's a question that actually might link to your experience or research with primates. So the question is, do we see the violence against women in other species? And maybe you could relate that to work with primates.
Yup, again, a wonderful question. When you look at social mammals, if you want to make some very broad generalizations, most social mammals fall into 2 categories. First category is what would be termed a pair bonding species. A female and a male stay together for their whole lives. They are the only ones they mate with. What you see is females and males are about the same size. You do not see big antlers on the males, bright coloration. They look like the females look like the males. The males spend about half their time taking care of the infants, just like the females do. There is very little aggression. In primates, South American monkeys, marmosets, tamarins fit that profile. Then you have what are called tournament species. The males are 2 times as big as the females. They're 3 times as big. The males fight. The females have to do all the care of the infants. The males die at a younger age because of fighting, high levels of aggression. And you look at those species, and the single biggest cause of injury and fighting are males fighting with each other. The second biggest cause is a male who is in a bad mood who attacks a female and leaves her injured. In the 33 years that I studied baboons, who are a tournament species, the most common cause of death of females by violence was not lions, was not hyenas, it was another male in a bad mood who attacked that female and left her with a bite that wound up killing her. So the question becomes, what about humans? And you look at humans, and not only are there distinctive features of behavior about pair bonding species and tournament species, distinctive features of anatomy, of lifespan. There are genetic diseases you see in tournament species, but not in pair bonding species. The lung volume, the amount of air your lungs could take in pair bonding species, males and females have lungs of the same size. In tournament species, males have bigger lung capacities. Like everything you could measure, you look at humans, and we are about halfway in between a typical pair bonding species and a typical tournament species. We are right in the middle. By what genes, the levels of a neurotransmitter called vasopressin in one part of our brain, developmental disorders having to do with mitochondria, how long we live, the size, the sperm count in males. If you were a pair bonding species, males have very low sperm count. In tournament species, for body size, humans right in the middle in every possible way. What is this? In terms of whether we are monogamous or polygamous, in terms of whether we have high degrees of male-female violence, in terms of everything you could measure, we are a species that is terribly confused as to what our nature is. And our nature is to be confused somewhere in the middle. And some of us biologically are much more like the pair bonders. Some of us are much more like the tournament species. And we even understand the biology of why some people are more one way or the other. And nevertheless, as a species as a whole, we are right in the middle and we are confused. And anybody who has ever been a poet or anybody who has ever been a lawyer for people divorcing understands that already.
Okay, now the big questions are coming. So, well, one question is, what your predictions would be in terms of the evolution of the brain in the future.
Oh my God.
And, I told you.
Okay.
I was wondering if you could also comment on a set of questions coming related to what we're experiencing right now, COVID-19, which puts us into a very, so to speak, understimulated environment, something that we are not used to. Would you expect any kind of consequences of this relatively long experience? What would you say?
Well, first off, in terms of evolution, if we survive this, and if we survive bacteria that are resistant to antibiotics, and if we survive nuclear war, and if we survive global warming, my guess is we are going to have evolved as a species that has resistance to depression, because otherwise we are not going to survive, and the rate of depression is increasing more and more. We are going to be a species that will have evolved more resistance to anxiety disorders, because we are evolving those more and more. Maybe we are going to be resistant to skin cancer, because the sun is going to be baking this planet so much that if we're not, we're all going to be killed by melanomas by the time we're 10 years old. Okay, so that is a pessimistic view of where things are going. In terms of COVID-19, it is a disaster. It is, in the United States, it is a disaster because, again, we are just about to have 100,000 people die, and most of those people will have died because we have a government that does not care about the poor. We have a government that is more interested in putting money into the military than it is in terms of healthcare and social services. We have it is sinful what has happened here in this country. And it is sinful that parts of this country, people who are Chinese American, have been harassed because this stupid virus started in China, and thus the president of the United States calls it the Chinese virus, and nonsense like that. This is a country where people have killed each other already because somebody has said, can you put on a mask before you come into this store? And they pull out a gun and shoot this person. This has happened now a number of times. This is a country where hatred of thems has become much more extreme because there is this scary disease, because people are losing their jobs. This is every now and then, it is making people at their best. The doctors are amazing. The people who are risking their lives to deliver food to sick people, all of that, they're wonderful. But at the same time, it is bringing out just some of the worst behavior in humans. And I think what this will be showing is, my parents were around 20 years old during the Great Depression in 1929. Just when they were in university, they had to end their university educations. They were poor, and that shaped them for the rest of their lives. When they were old people, they were worrying about if they still had enough money in the bank because of what they were like when they were 20 years old during the Great Depression. My children are 20 years old in university, and this has completely changed their world. And whether or not they will be getting jobs easily for the next 10 years until the world recovers from this. And when they're 80 years old, this will have been one of the things that will have traumatized them for the rest of their lives. And some of the things that we'll have done is leave people with some of their worst and ugliest reflexes in them for years and years to come. And this is an incredibly sad thing to see.
Okay. So I think the examples, the research findings that you mentioned were really very vivid and visual. So it had affected lots of our listeners. And one of them was the study on blood sugar level. So I'd like you ask a question about that from the audience and connect it to another question. The question is, well, if really decreased blood sugar level affects me so much, can we say that I actually have in responsibility for my behavior? And then connecting to the other more general questions, question that a couple of audience members asked, what would be your views on free will?
Okay. First, to answer the really difficult question before I get to the totally impossible difficult question, the blood sugar ones, there has been one case in the United States. This was a famous case. I live in the city of San Francisco, which is about 30 kilometers from Stanford University. In the 1990s, 1980s, I was not here yet, but one man did a political assassination and he killed the mayor of San Francisco. And this was then a famous trial. And his lawyers argued that he was addicted to high blood sugar levels and he ate a lot of junk food, garbage, sugary food, and that day he had not eaten yet, and that is why he was not able to stop himself from killing the person. And you say, oh my God, that is the craziest thing. And everyone was predicting he would be put in jail for the rest of his life, and he was given a jail sentence of 8 years before he got out of jail. And everyone said, oh my God, that is the craziest thing. And that was like completely crazy that that was done. Yes, this aspect of biology was important. A more important aspect was that this was a hateful man who had all sorts of prejudices, and it predicted that he was going to do something like this. Okay, so yes, it's very interesting that blood sugar levels can have something to do with how well your frontal cortex is going to work. Remember, though, in that context, that a strong frontal cortex is not necessarily a very good thing, because you need a strong frontal cortex to have been Gandhi, to have been Nelson Mandela, to have been the Dalai Lama. You also need to have had a strong frontal cortex to have been somebody, you know, a Bosnian Serb killing, you know, people in death camps there because you would rather sleep in late or play with your kids. Oh no, have a strong frontal cortex. I got to go to work to commit genocide and do a good job. Doing the harder thing is a value-free thing. In terms of free will, at the end of the day, I do not believe there is any free will whatsoever. I believe we are nothing more and nothing less than our biology. It is an unbelievably complicated biology, but I am completely at peace with this idea. At the same time, I have absolutely no idea how we are supposed to live if everybody started believing that there was no free will. There could be no such things as prisons anymore, but there could be no such thing as saying to somebody, wow, you did a good job on that exam. There could be no such thing as blaming anyone for anything. There could be no such thing as praising anyone. And I cannot understand how the world is supposed to function. And in fact, I spend all my time doing this, and I spend half my time in courtrooms now talking to juries about how biology works and wrestling with these things. And I'm writing a book, which is to say, I should have finished it 2 years ago, and I'm getting nowhere with it because the book is about how people are supposed to like function if they believe there is no free will. I don't know, because if somebody says something nice to me, I still feel happy afterward if they complimented me. And if I hear about somebody who's done something awful, I still wish terrible things for them before I think through, wait a second, when they were a fetus, they were exposed to stress hormones. And when they were 10 years old, they were mistreated in this way. And when I was 15 years old, I got a good education, and like thinking through that. And it makes you crazy because I have no idea how we are supposed to function that way. The only thing I feel certain of is if you really, really believe that way, there are two things you have to conclude. The first one is you do not deserve anything. You are not entitled to anything. You are not entitled to more of anything than anybody else is. And the other thing is it makes no sense biologically, neurobiologically, evolutionarily, genetically, it makes no sense to ever hate anyone because there's no reason to do it. And it is an enormously difficult task to decide that it is not okay to think in terms of hate, and it is not okay to think, I deserve better treatment than anybody else does. And that's so hard to think that way.
Okay, maybe we'll have just one more question and then finish this excellent, stimulating talk, and not to take so much more of your time as well. I think linking to what you said about the prison system and that you are actually, working with the system, there were a couple of questions about that. And the question was about more practical issues. Could we develop some practices on the basis of what your research and what you suggested to better the criminal justice system? Is there anything done even at the general, as a list of suggestions?
Teach people a lot more science. Make sure that the people who become lawyers and judges and law school professors are not the people who hated biology when they were in college, because those were all the people when, like all of us were learning science, they were saying, oh my God, biology is the most boring thing on earth. And they were taking political philosophy and they were reading and one of the things I've discovered when I work with lawyers or judges, I've taught judges about the brain, and they hate biology and they don't know anything about it, and they do not want to know anything about it. And the juries think the same way. So that is one small solution. The bigger solution is the criminal justice system doesn't make any sense at all. This is not to say a violent, dangerous person should be out on the street. If you have an automobile and the brakes do not work, you cannot let that car be out on the street. You fix the brakes if you can. If you cannot fix the brakes, you turn the car off and you put it inside a garage. But you do not sit there and say, that car does not deserve to be able to take a ride in a park on a beautiful day. And it's got to be the same way. This person has something wrong with their brain. And in 99% of the time, we do not know how to fix it. We cannot, and it will be hundreds of years or thousands of years before the science is at a point. And we say, I am sorry, this person has to be locked away forever, but do not tell me about them having a bad soul or being evil. They are a machine. They are a broken machine, just as some of us are machines that work well. And they are a broken machine because they had terrible luck and nothing more or nothing less than that. And you have to make their life as pleasant as is possible while protecting everyone else from them. And that's really hard to do.
Okay. Thank you very much. I would like to first thank all our audience members. We have had, just to let you know as well, around 900 guests. So wow. It was a big, big audience. We all thank them for their questions, their contributions. Unfortunately, time limits us to ask all of them, but I hope we were able to get most of the questions directly or indirectly. And I want to thank you, Professor Sapolsky, for taking the time and talking to us and being with us. This has been an excellent talk and experience for us, and I'm talking on behalf of all the audience members, I'm sure. So thank you very much. We appreciate it deeply.
Well, thank you all. And I hope everyone there is safe and healthy and are as kind to each other as we all should try to be. So thank you. Have a very good day.
You too. Thank you very much.
Good.
Bye-bye.